5:15 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. USS Gerald R. Ford was already turning into the wind when the first high-priority flash message reached the bridge. From the Office of Naval Intelligence. The carrier had been on a routine transition toward the Strait of Hormuz, but the data appearing on the tactical screens suggested that this morning would be anything but routine. The air over the flight deck was heavy with the smell of jet fuel and the humid, salty bite of the Gulf morning. Below the surface, the hull of the 100,000-ton warship vibrated with a sudden increase in revolutions, as the 4 nuclear reactors pushed more power to the propulsion shafts. On the bridge, the commanding officer stood by the central console, watching the blue and red icons populate the primary tactical display. For 72 hours, the Iranian Navy had been conducting what they called a scheduled exercise, but the movement patterns had shifted in the last 60 minutes. Instead of the typical coastal maneuvers, nearly every operational surface combatant in the taken Iranian inventory had cleared the breakwaters at Bandar Abbas and Bushehr. They were now forming into 3 distinct surface action groups, moving at 22 knots on an intercept course with the United States Carrier Strike Group. The intelligence was clear and undeniable. This was not a demonstration of Gada presence, but a coordinated sortie designed to saturate the defenses of the most advanced warship in the United States Navy. The primary threat was identified as a mix of Muj-class frigates and Common-class missile boats, supported by hundreds of fast attack craft. These smaller vessels were currently fanning out in a massive screen, intended to mask the larger combatants and overwhelm the carrier's sensor arrays through sheer numbers. Inside Combat Direction Center, the environment was a controlled hum of professional intensity. Tactical action officers communicated in the clipped, precise language of a high-end naval engagement. The AN/SPY-6 radar system was already operating in a high-intensity pulse mode, slicing through the morning haze to track over 200 individual surface contacts. Each contact was assigned a track number, and the computer systems began calculating intercept solutions for the strike group's long-range weapons. The commander of Carrier Strike Group 12 issued the order to elevate the readiness condition to 1 Alpha. This meant every sailor was at their station, every weapon system was powered on, and the flight deck was prepared for a maximum effort launch. On the 4.5-acre flight deck, the yellow-shirted aircraft handlers moved with practiced speed, positioning the first wave of F/A-18 Super Hornets toward the 4 electromagnetic catapults. The steam and heat from the deck rose into the twilight sky, mingling with the roar of twin General Electric engines, being tested at high power. At 5:25 in the morning, the first E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye was flung off catapult number 2. The twin turboprop aircraft climbed steeply, its massive rotating radar dome immediately beginning to feed a high-resolution picture of the entire Persian Gulf back to the strike group. This airborne early warning asset was the eyes of the fleet, capable of seeing over the horizon and detecting the low-slung Iranian missile boats before they could come within range of the carrier's primary sensors. Behind the Hawkeye, 4 F/A-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 87 followed in rapid succession. The electromagnetic launch system operated with a metallic hum, followed by the sudden, violent acceleration that sent the 20-ton fighters from 0 to 160 knots in under 3 seconds. The pilots immediately climbed to 20,000 feet, establishing a combat air patrol that would serve as the first line of defense against any Iranian aerial or surface-to-surface missile threats. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as the Iranian vessels crossed the 24-mile limit of their territorial waters. At coordinates 26 degrees north, 53 degrees east, the Iranian flagship, a Muj-class frigate, turned its primary search radar to a fire control frequency. This was a direct provocation and a clear signal of intent. The electronic warfare suites on the USS Gerald R. Ford instantly detected the change in signal, and an audible alarm echoed through the Combat Direction Center. The strike group was not alone in this theater. The cruiser USS Normandy and the destroyers USS Ramage and USS Thomas Hudner moved into a protective screen 5 miles ahead of the carrier. These vessels were the heavy hitters of the Aegis combat system. Their Mark 41 vertical launch cells filled with a variety of defensive and offensive missiles. Each ship took its position with mathematical precision, creating a layered defense that stretched for hundreds of miles. The air was thick with the silent energy of a fleet preparing for the first major naval battle of the 26th year of the century. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, casting a long, golden light over the steel-gray water. It was a beautiful morning, but no one on the bridge was looking at the sunrise. They were looking at the red icons that were now less than 100 nautical miles away and closing fast. The United States Navy was about to demonstrate why the carrier strike group remains the most formidable projection of power on the planet. 5:30 in the morning. The Central Persian Gulf. The destroyer DDG-61 USS Ramage surged through the choppy gray swells. At a flanking speed of 32 knots, white spray erupted from its raked bow, drenching the forward 5-inch gun mount, and leaving a long, churning wake that stretched for miles across the dark water. As the designated shotgun escort, the destroyer maintained a station, exactly 5 miles off the starboard quarter of the carrier, its primary mission to serve as the final kinetic barrier against any leeward side threats. The geometry of Carrier Strike Group 12 was now a masterpiece of defensive engineering, a series of concentric circles designed to identify and kill anything that entered without authorization. At the outermost edge, 60 miles from the carrier, the cruiser CG-71 USS Normandy acted as the primary air warfare commander. Its 4 massive radar arrays were radiating at maximum power, pushing a high-frequency electronic wall against the Iranian coastline. The air around the cruiser's superstructure hummed with the invisible energy of the AN/SPY-6 radar, a force so powerful it could detect a golf ball-sized object moving at 3 times the speed of sound. Beneath the surface of the warm Gulf water, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of the strike group's sonar. 2 miles ahead of the main formation, the Virginia-class fast-attack submarine moved at a depth of 150 meters. Its passive sonar arrays were tuned to the specific acoustic signatures of Iranian Kilo-class submarines known to be based at Bandar Abbas. The crew of the American submarine worked in near darkness, their faces illuminated by the soft green glow of tactical displays. As they mapped the thermal layers of the sea to hide their own acoustic footprint, the combat air patrol was now fully established, at an altitude of 22,000 feet. 8 FA-18 Super Hornets were divided into 2 ship sections, orbiting at specific points known as the cap stations. The pilots adjusted their oxygen masks and scanned the horizon. Their radar screens linked directly to the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye orbiting high above. This data link allowed the fighters to see every Iranian movement without ever turning on their own radars, remaining electronically silent and nearly invisible to enemy sensors. Remaining electronically silent and nearly invisible to enemy sensors, the humidity of the Persian Gulf began to rise with the sun, creating a thick morning mist that clung to the steel hulls of the warships. Inside the air-conditioned compartments of the ships, the crews were shielded from the oppressive heat, but the tension was palpable. Every sailor was wearing flash protective gear, long beige gloves and hoods designed to prevent burns in the event of a missile strike. They were the silent professionals of the United States Navy, moving with a disciplined calm that masked the high-stakes reality of the coming engagement. At 5:45 in the morning, the tactical picture on the carrier's flag bridge showed the Iranian surface action groups split into 2 wings. The first wing, consisting of 10 missile boats, was attempting to outflank the American destroyers by hugging the shallow waters near the Iranian coast. The second wing, centered around 2 Muj-class frigates, was driving straight for the center of the strike group. This was a classic pincer maneuver designed to force the American commanders to split their attention and their defensive fire. The commander of the strike group, observing from the bridge of the USS Gerald R. remained unmoved. He knew the capabilities of his ships and the training of his personnel. The tactical disposition of the American fleet was not just about positioning. It was about the integration of every sensor and weapon into a single, lethal organism. The order was given to the USS Thomas Hudner to shift its station 3,000 yards to the west, closing a gap in the radar coverage and preparing the Mark 41 vertical launch system for an immediate surface-to-surface engagement. The deck of the carrier continued to be a hive of controlled violence. Another 4 Super Hornets were being fueled, the sharp, chemical smell of JP-5 aviation fuel mixing with the humid morning air. The ordnance teams were busy loading AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles onto the wing pylons. Each weapon was checked and double-checked, the yellow-shirted handlers ensuring that every circuit was live and every safety pin was removed. As the clock ticked towards 6 in the morning, the two opposing forces were now less than 80 miles apart. The time for maneuvering was rapidly coming to an end. The Iranian vessels were accelerating, their wakes turning to white foam as they pushed their engines to the limit. They were moving into the kill zone of the United States Navy, a space where geography and technology would soon collide with devastating results. 6 in the morning. The airspace between the carrier strike group and the Iranian coast. 2 A-18 Gulf Growlers from Electronic Attack Squadron 130 banked hard to the east, their wingtips slicing through the humid morning air at 500 knots. These aircraft were the digital scalps of the United States Navy, carrying the most sophisticated electronic warfare suites ever mounted on a tactical airframe. Below their wings, the bulky ANALQ-99 jamming pods hummed with a low-frequency vibration, a physical manifestation of the immense electrical power being converted into invisible waves of interference. The cockpit of the lead Growler was a claustrophobic world of flickering green displays and the constant, high-pitched whine of cooling fans working to keep the high-voltage electronics from melting. The electronic warfare officer in the rear seat adjusted the gain on his primary sensor screen, watching as the Iranian coastal radar network began to light up in response to the American presence. On the glass of his multi-function display, dozens of red spikes represented the search and fire control radars of the Iranian Muj-class frigates and land-based HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries. The commander of the flight issued a single, calm command over the encrypted tactical net to begin the suppression of enemy air defenses. With a series of keystrokes, the electronic warfare officers initiated a coordinated, high-power jamming sequence. The jamming pods erupted with a massive burst of electromagnetic energy, targeted precisely at the frequencies used by the Iranian radar systems. This was not a broad, clumsy noise, but a surgical digital attack that mimicked the Iranian signals, feeding them back into their own receivers, to create a wall of blinding white noise. On the bridges of the Iranian warships, the tactical picture disintegrated in an instant. Radar screens that had been tracking the American carrier strike group were suddenly filled with thousands of false targets and shifting patterns of electronic snow. The Iranian operators attempted to hop to different frequencies, but the artificial intelligence inside the Growlers tracked every move in microseconds, following them across the spectrum, and re-establishing the jam before a single valid track could be formed. The smell of ozone and hot metal filled the cockpits of the Growlers as the systems pushed the limits of their cooling capacity. This electronic shield was the essential precursor to the kinetic engagement. By blinding the day, Iranian fleet, the United States Navy, had effectively removed the enemy's ability to launch long-range anti-ship missiles with any degree of accuracy. The Iranian vessels were now forced to rely on their own visual lookouts and short-range sensors, reducing their effective engagement range from 100 miles to less than 15. The air above the Persian Gulf was now a chaotic mess of invisible energy, a digital storm that favored the side with the most advanced processing power. At the same time, the Growlers began a secondary mission known as communications jamming. They targeted the high-frequency and ultra-high-frequency radio links used by the Iranian command and control centers at Bandar Abbas. In seconds, the coordination between the 3 Iranian surface action groups was severed. Orders from the shore-based admirals became unintelligible static, and the individual Iranian captains were left to make decisions in a vacuum of information. The disciplined, three-pronged pincer movement began to fragment as ships hesitated, unsure of the location of their wingmen or the status of the American fleet. While the Iranians were blinded and deafened, the United States Strike Group remained perfectly synchronized. Using the Link 16 data network, the USS Gerald R. Ford and its escorts shared a crystal-clear tactical picture that was entirely unaffected by their own jamming. This was the result of decades of engineering, allowing American forces to operate within their own electronic interference while the enemy was paralyzed by it. The air was thick with the silent roar of the electronic war, a conflict where the winners were decided by lines of code and megahertz of bandwidth. The humidity continued to build as the sun rose higher, creating a shimmering heat haze over the water. To the naked eye, the sky looked empty and peaceful, but to the sensors of the carrier strike group, it was a battlefield of intense activity. The electronic warfare officer in the lead growler watched as the Iranian radar signatures began to fade into the noise floor. He confirmed the successful suppression of the first layer of the enemy's integrated defense system. The way was now clear for the heavy hitters of the strike group to begin the process of physical destruction. The order was transmitted from the carrier to the cruiser USS Normandy to prepare for the first phase of the offensive strike. The electronic shield had done its job, creating a window of tactical superiority that would last as long as the Growlers had fuel in their tanks. Every sailor in the tanks' bin, Strike Group knew that the transition from the electronic war to the kinetic war was only minutes away. The silence of the morning was about to be shattered by the launch of 48 long-range anti-ship missiles. 6:10 in the morning. The flag bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The transition from a state of heightened readiness to active combat is a process governed by the strict application of the rules of engagement.
Proceed.
Inside the glass-enclosed command center, the admiral and his staff watched the large-screen displays as the red icons of the Iranian surface action group crossed the final tactical threshold. The Iranian vessels were now within 60 nautical miles of the American destroyer screen, and their maneuvers had become unmistakably aggressive. They were no longer merely shadowing the fleet. They were positioning themselves for a saturated missile launch. The commanding officer of the strike group received a direct voice transmission from the Indo-Pacific Command, confirming that all diplomatic channels had been exhausted and the threat to United States assets was deemed imminent. The formal authorization for weapons-free was disseminated through the fleet via the secure, jam-resistant data links. This was the moment the entire strike group had been training for the pivot, from defensive posturing to the systematic application of overwhelming force. The air in the command center remained professional and calm, the only sound being the steady cadence of status reports from the various warfare commanders. On the cruiser USS Normandy and the destroyers USS Ramage and USS Thomas Hudner, the technical preparation for a coordinated strike began in earnest. The weapons officers initiated the fire-up sequence for the Mark 41 vertical launch systems. In the depths of each ship, the missile cells were pressurized and the self-diagnostic programs began their final sweeps. Each cell contained a long-range anti-ship missile, a weapon designed specifically to penetrate the most sophisticated point defense systems of a modern surface fleet. The ship's computers were fed the targeting data generated by the E-2 Delta Hawkeye, ensuring that each missile was assigned a specific Iranian vessel to eliminate the possibility of double targeting. The engagement criteria were based on a strategy of layered attrition. The first objective was the neutralization of the 3 Iranian Muj-class frigates, which served as the command and control nodes for the smaller missile boats. By removing the brains of the Iranian formation, the American commanders intended to leave the remaining fast attack craft disorganized and vulnerable to short-range defensive fire. The coordinates for the primary targets were confirmed at latitude 26 degrees north, longitude 53 degrees 2 minutes east. The distance was 58 nautical miles, well within the lethal reach of the American arsenal. On the flight deck of the carrier, the final 4 F-A-18 Super Hornets were cleared for launch. These aircraft were configured as missile trucks, carrying the maximum possible load of anti-ship ordnance to supplement the fire. From the surface ships, the smell of burning rubber from the catapult seals and the sharp chemical odor of jet exhaust filled the air as the fighters were slung into the morning sky. The strike group was now a fully integrated weapon system, with sensors in the air, on the surface, and below the water, all feeding into a single, unified, tactical plan. The technical complexity of the Mark 41 vertical launch system is a marvel of American naval engineering. Each of the 64 cells on the USS Thomas Hudner was a self-contained launch platform, capable of firing a missile every 3 seconds. As the countdown reached the final 60 seconds, the ship's Aegis combat system assumed control of the launch sequence. The deck of the destroyer began to vibrate as the cooling pumps for the launch cells increased their flow rate, preparing for the intense thermal shock of the rocket motors igniting. The tactical action officer on the USS Gerald R. monitored the status of the Iranian swarm of fast attack boats. These vessels were now accelerating to 40 knots, attempting to close the distance before the American long-range weapons could be brought to bear. The Iranian commanders were banking on their ability to get within range of their own shorter-range C-802 missiles, hoping that sheer numbers would allow at least a few to penetrate the American screen. It was a race against time and technology, and the United States Navy was about to pull the trigger. The environmental conditions remained stable, with a light wind from the northwest and a 2-meter swell. The morning sun was now fully above the horizon, reflecting off the steel gray hulls of the American warships. The humidity was thick, making the air feel heavy, but the internal systems of the strike group were operating at peak efficiency. The final check of the data link confirmed that all assets were synchronized to the millisecond. At exactly 6:20 in the morning, the order was given to commence firing. The silence of the Persian Gulf was about to be replaced by the roar of solid-fuel rocket motors and the scream of low-flying missiles. The engagement was no longer a theoretical exercise or a geopolitical standoff. It was a kinetic reality. The first wave of 48 long-range anti-ship missiles was programmed to launch in a staggered sequence, creating a wall of steel and high explosives that would travel just feet above the waves toward the Iranian fleet. 6:20 in the morning. The destroyer DDG-116 USS Thomas Hudner. The command battery's releases echoed through the ship's internal circuit with the cold finality of a machine. The vertical launch system hatches on the forward deck flipped open in a synchronized sequence, revealing the darkened cells that held the primary offensive power of the strike group. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the weapons officer pressed the final execution key, initiating a computer-controlled launch sequence that was timed to the millisecond. The air around the destroyer, already thick with the heavy humidity of the Gulf, seemed to hold its breath for a single heartbeat before the first engine ignited. The first long-range anti-ship missile shrieked out of its cell with a violence that shook the 9,200-ton hull of the destroyer. A massive pillar of orange flame and brilliant white smoke punched through the morning haze, the roar of the solid rocket booster cracking eardrums and rattling the glass on the bridge. The heat blast washed across the forward superstructure, carrying the sharp chemical bite of burning propellant and the smell of ionized air. One after another, 24 missiles erupted from the Thomas Hudner and the nearby USS Ramage, their white exhaust trails creating a dense forest of smoke that momentarily blotted out the rising sun. The sky was torn apart by the sound of 48 engines screaming toward the horizon, leaving a lingering smell of burnt ozone that hung over the water. The missiles climbed to 500 feet before pitching over and diving toward the surface of the water. They transitioned to sea skimming mode, dropping to just 10 feet above the waves and accelerating to high subsonic speeds. Guided by internal artificial intelligence and mid-course corrections from the E-2 Delta Hawkeye, the missiles fanned out in a wide arc, designed to strike the Iranian fleet from multiple angles simultaneously. They were silent hunters, their low observable skins making them nearly invisible to the few Iranian radars that were still trying to burn through the American electronic jamming. The lead Iranian frigate, The Sahand never saw the first strike coming through the dense electronic fog. Two missiles slammed into the port side just above the waterline at over 600 miles per hour. The warheads punched clean through the light armor and detonated deep inside the auxiliary machinery room, the blast wave throwing 30 tons of engine components through the opposite side of the hull. A massive fireball erupted instantly, blowing the side of the ship outward in a jagged mess of scorched steel and shattered aluminum. The secondary explosion of the ship's own fuel cells sent a column of oily black smoke 300 feet into the air, visible for 20 miles. On the second Iranian frigate, the crew reacted in a frenzy of disorganized panic. The captain ordered a hard turn to starboard, while their short-range point defense guns began to spray lead into the empty sky. The operators firing blindly at shadows and false radar returns. But the defensive fire was too little and far too late. A third missile struck the bridge directly, the kinetic energy alone severing the entire superstructure from the hull in a spray of glass, wire, and metal fragments. The ship veered out of control, its engines screaming at redline as it began a slow, terminal roll to the left, water pouring into the open wounds of its hull. Burning oil spread rapidly across the surface of the water, the orange flames reflecting off the thick morning mist like a hellish neon sign. The once proud Iranian Surface Action Group was now a collection of drifting, broken wrecks, and panicked survivors jumping into the sea to escape the searing heat. The radio frequencies, which had been filled with coordinated commands just minutes ago, were now a chaotic mess of screams, static, and desperate calls for help that went unanswered. The silence that followed the impacts was broken only by the crackle of burning metal and the distant, muffled thud of internal compartments collapsing under the weight of the sea. At 6:30 in the morning, the tactical screens on the USS Gerald R updated to show the devastation. 3 Muj-class frigates and 4 Cayman-class missile boats were confirmed as sunk or sinking. The primary command structure of the Iranian fleet had been obliterated in less than 10 minutes. The remaining fast attack craft, seeing their flagship vanish in a pillar of fire, began to break formation, some turning back toward the coast while others drifted aimlessly, their crews stunned by the speed and precision of the American strike. The United States Navy had achieved total tactical overmatch. The long-range engagement had proven the lethality of the integrated strike group, demonstrating that even a numerically superior force could be dismantled systematically before they ever reached their own firing range. The commander of the strike group ordered the destroyers to maintain their stations and prepare for the next phase of the operation, the subsurface interdiction. While the surface of the Gulf was a graveyard of Iranian steel, the threat from below still remained to be settled. 6:35 in the morning, 150 meters below the surface of the Persian Gulf, the Virginia-class fast-attack submarine USS New Jersey moved through the thermal layers of the sea with the silent grace of a predator. Inside the control room, the lighting was shifted to a deep tactical red, casting long, sharp shadows across the faces of the sonar technicians. These men sat in absolute silence, their ears tuned to the high-fidelity acoustic data flowing from the large aperture bow array and the thin, mile-long towed array trailing behind the boat. The air inside the submarine was cool and filtered, carrying the faint, sterile scent of ozone and recycled oxygen that defined life in the deep. The acoustic environment of the Persian Gulf was a crowded, chaotic mess of noise following the surface engagement. The sinking Iranian frigates were breaking apart as they descended toward the seafloor, their hulls groaning and snapping under the increasing pressure. Despite this wall of sound, the lead sonar man identified a specific, rhythmic signature that did not belong to the wreckage. At coordinates 26 degrees 4 minutes north, 53 degrees 8 minutes east, a faint mechanical hum was detected. It was the cavitation of a diesel-electric engine, the unmistakable fingerprint of an Iranian Kilo-class submarine operating on battery power. The commanding officer of the USS New Jersey stood over the waterfall displays, his eyes tracking the bearing of the contact. The Iranian submarine was positioned 10 miles ahead of the carrier, attempting to drift silently into a firing position for its wake-homing torpedoes. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, played in total darkness. The American submarine held the technological advantage, its ultra-quiet pump jet propulsor allowing it to maneuver without alerting the enemy to its presence. The order was given to flood tubes 1 and 2 as the fire control computer began to calculate a three-dimensional intercept solution. The mechanical clank of the torpedo tube shutters opening was muffled by the surrounding water, but to the crew inside the hull, it felt like a thunderclap. 2 Mark 48 advanced capability torpedoes were armed and ready. These were not simple fire-and-forget weapons. They were sophisticated underwater drones linked to the submarine by a thin, fiber optic wire. This allowed the weapons officer to steer the torpedoes manually, bypassing the Iranian submarine's acoustic decoys and electronic countermeasures. The tension in the room was a physical weight, broken only by the steady, calm voice of the diving officer, maintaining the ship's depth and trim. At 6:45 in the morning, the order to fire was executed. The 2 torpedoes were ejected from the tubes by a burst of high-pressure water, their engines igniting seconds later with a high-pitched whine that surged to 45 knots. The weapons tore through the cold, dark water, leaving a trail of tiny bubbles in their wake. On the sonar screens, the Iranian Kilo-class submarine suddenly accelerated, its captain realizing too late that the hunter had become the prey. The Iranian boat attempted a desperate crash dive, its crew blowing emergency ballast in a frantic effort to change depth and confuse the incoming weapons. The first Mark 48 torpedo punched into the stern of the Kilo-class submarine at 60 knots. The 300-kilogram high-explosive warhead detonated against the pressure hull, the blast wave instantly crushing the engine room and severing the propeller shaft. The sound of the explosion was a dull, heavy thud that resonated through the hull of the USS New Jersey miles away. The second torpedo followed 4 seconds later, striking the Iranian boat amidships and breaking its spine. The submarine erupted in a violent sequence of internal deck collapses and battery fires, the immense pressure of the sea finishing what the explosives had started. The aftermath was a series of haunting acoustic signatures. As the Iranian submarine began its terminal descent to the bottom of the Gulf, sonar recorded the sound of air tanks rupturing, and the final, sharp cracks of the hull yielding to the weight of the water. Within minutes, the ocean was silent again, save for the distant, dying echoes of the surface battle far above. The threat to the carrier's hull from below had been systematically eliminated, executed with the cold, surgical precision that is the hallmark of the United States submarine force. The USS New Jersey maintained its patrol, moving slowly away from the site of the kill to avoid any lingering acoustic detection. The commanding officer sent a short, encrypted burst transmission to the carrier strike group. Subsurface threat neutralized. 1 Kilo-class submarine confirmed destroyed. The air in the control room remained quiet as the crew returned to their standard watch rotation. There was no celebration, only the professional satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The subsurface shield of the strike group remained unbroken, and the carrier continued its advance, protected by a layer of steel and silence that the enemy could not penetrate. 6:50 in the morning. The waters surrounding the USS Gerald R. The radar screens in the Combat Direction Center were now saturated with dozens of small, high-speed returns moving in a jagged, flickering line across the tactical display. The Iranian surface fleet's larger combatants had been neutralized, but the secondary threat, a massive swarm of over 40 fast attack craft, was now making its final run. These vessels, ranging from Boghammer speedboats to missile-armed Zulfikar patrol boats, were screaming across the surface at speeds exceeding 45 knots, their fiberglass hulls bouncing violently over the 2-meter swells. The commander of the air wing ordered the immediate deployment of the swarm kill package. 4 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, already airborne and holding at 5 miles from the carrier, were cleared to engage. These helicopters were the workhorses of the fleet's inner-tier defense, each equipped with 2 4-round launchers for the AGM-114 Hellfire missile and a cabin-mounted M240 machine gun. The pilots dove toward the water, the salt spray from the rotor wash creating a localized mist, as they leveled off just 50 feet above the sea to begin their high-speed intercept. On the destroyers USS Ramage and USS Thomas Hudner, the gun crews manned the Mark 38 25mm machine guns and the newly installed 30mm Bushmaster cannons. Unlike the long-range missile engagement, this was a close-quarters battle, fought within the visual range of the human eye. The air around the ships was thick with the smell of hot lubricating oil and the ozone of high-voltage electric motors, as the gun turrets slewed with robotic precision, slaving their optics to the infrared sensors that tracked the heat signatures of the Iranian outboard engines. The trigger was squeezed on the lead MH-60 Sierra helicopter. A Hellfire missile shrieked off the rail, a brilliant white column of fire, punching backward through the morning light. The heat blast from the rocket motor washed across the open cabin door, carrying the sharp chemical bite of burning propellant. The missile streaked across the 3-mile gap in less than 8 seconds, its laser guidance system locked onto the center mass of the lead Zulfikar boat. The warhead punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the Iranian craft, detonating the fuel tank and the ready-use ammunition for its 12.7mm heavy machine gun. The boat erupted instantly in a jagged fireball that sent pieces of white-hot debris flying 50 meters into the air. The kinetic energy of the impact was so great that the vessel's engine was torn from its mounts and sent skip-glancing across the water like a stone. A thick pillar of oily black smoke rose from the spot where the boat had been, the fire so intense it bleached the morning sky white for several seconds. The Iranian crews in the following boats reacted with a mix of desperation and panic. They began to weave in a chaotic serpentine pattern, firing unguided rockets and machine guns toward the American warships. The water around the USS Ramage was chewed into white foam by hundreds of small-caliber rounds, the metal clanging harmlessly against the thick steel armor of the destroyer's hull. The Iranian defenders attempted to return fire, but their platforms were too unstable in the rough water to achieve a localized lock, their rounds flying high into the empty sky, or splashing uselessly into the sea. The deck-mounted 30mm cannons on the destroyers opened fire with a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud. Each high-explosive incendiary shell traveled at 3,000 feet per second, tearing through the light hulls of the speedboats as if they were made of paper. In a span of 90 seconds, 6 more Iranian vessels were shredded by the concentrated fire, their structures collapsing into the water. As the shells obliterated everything above the waterline, the sea was now littered with burning fiberglass, orange life vests, and the spreading rainbow of spilled gasoline. The humidity of the Gulf morning carried the acrid stink of burnt powder and the iron smell of blood and sea salt. The remaining Iranian craft, realizing they could not penetrate the wall of lead and fire, began to break away, their engines screaming as they turned back toward the safety of the coastal shallows. But the American helicopters were relentless, chasing the stragglers and methodically picking them off with short, controlled bursts from their cabin guns. The professional discipline of the United States Navy was on full display. There was no wasted ammunition, only the systematic removal of a localized threat. By 7:15 in the morning, the swarm had been decimated. Of the original 40-vessel formation, only 12 remained operational, and they were in full retreat toward the Iranian mainland. The defensive perimeter of the carrier strike group remained pristine, with no damage reported to any United States vessel, and only minor superficial scarring on the destroyer hulls. The commander of the strike group issued a clear for the inner-tier defense, though the crews remained at their guns, scanning the horizon for any second wave. The morning sun was now high enough to reveal the true scale of the destruction. The Persian Gulf was a graveyard of small boats, the black smoke from the various wrecks forming a dark cloud that hung low over the water. The United States Navy had proven that even the most aggressive swarm tactics were no match for integrated sensors and professional gunnery. The immediate threat to the carrier's skin had been neutralized, allowing the fleet to pivot back to its primary strategic objective, the total neutralization of the remaining Iranian heavy surface assets. 7:20 in the morning. The central Persian Gulf, 20 miles south of Abu Musa Island. The final remnants of the Iranian surface fleet consisting of 2 Bayandor-class corvettes and the last operational Muj-class frigate, were detected at coordinates 25 degrees 58 minutes north, 55 degrees 10 minutes east. These vessels were no longer attempting a coordinated strike. They were operating in a desperate last stand configuration, positioning themselves between the American carrier strike group and the Iranian mainland. The morning sun was now high and harsh, reflecting off the steel gray water with a brilliance that made the tactical displays in the American ships seem even more clinical. The cruiser CG-73 USS Port Royal surged ahead of the carrier screen, its 4 massive gas turbine engines pushing the 10,000-ton warship to 30 knots. The commanding officer of the cruiser coordinated directly with the destroyer USS Thomas Hudner to initiate a combined arms surface engagement. USS Thomas Hudner to initiate a combined arms surface engagement. This was to be a demonstration of raw naval gunnery and short-range missile lethality. The order was transmitted across the tactical net. Target designated. Surface Action Group North. Engagement authorized. On the forward deck of the USS Port Royal, the Mark 45 Mod 4 5-inch gun slewed rapidly to a bearing of 045. The Mark 45 Mod 4 5-inch gun slewed rapidly to a bearing of 045. The automated loading system in the magazine below whistled, with the sound of hydraulic fluid under high pressure as it hoisted the 70-pound high-explosive projectiles into the breach. In the Combat Direction Center, the gunnery officer watched the digital infrared feed from the mast-mounted sensor, which showed the Iranian frigate clearly against the cool morning horizon. The atmosphere inside the cruiser was a focused, rhythmic hum of technical perfection. The trigger was squeezed. The 5-inch gun erupted with a bone-jarring roar that sent a shockwave rippling across the deck and through the boots of every sailor on board. A massive ring of white smoke and orange flame expanded from the muzzle, followed by the sharp, metallic clang of the spent casing being ejected onto the deck. The smell of burnt cordite and hot steel instantly filled the air around the turret. Within seconds, a volley of 10 rounds was in the air, traveling at over 800 meters per second toward the Iranian flagship. The first shell punched straight through the thin aluminum plating of the Iranian frigate's forward superstructure, detonating inside the communication suite. The explosion sent a spray of jagged shrapnel and shattered electronic consoles through the bulkheads, instantly severing the ship's ability to coordinate its remaining assets. 2 more shells struck the waterline. Near the engine room, the high-explosive warheads rupturing the hull and sending thousands of tons of seawater surging into the lower compartments. A massive fireball erupted from the center of the ship as a fuel line was severed, the heat so intense it began to melt the radar mast above it. The crew of the Iranian frigate reacted with a frantic, uncoordinated response. They attempted to return fire with their 76mm forward gun, but the vibration from the internal explosions made a precise lock impossible. Their rounds splashed harmlessly into the sea, 300 meters short of the American cruiser. On the deck, sailors could be seen. Through the long-range optics running toward the lifeboats, their silhouettes stark against the orange glow of the growing fire. The ship began to list heavily to port. The internal deck collapses, creating a series of deep, metallic groans that carried across the water. Black smoke rose in a towering column from the wreckage, the oily cloud drifting slowly toward the Iranian coast. The once proud vessel was now a hollowed-out shell, its engines dead and its weapons silenced. The surrounding corvettes, seeing their leader obliterated, attempted to execute a high-speed turn to flee, but the USS Thomas Hudner was already closing the distance. The destroyer launched a pair of Harpoon anti-ship missiles, the white exhaust trails cutting a low, horizontal line across the surface of the water before slamming into the sterns of both retreating vessels. The heat from the burning wrecks was a physical presence that could be felt even from several miles away, a shimmering distortion in the humid air. The smell of burning rubber, diesel oil, and something far more acrid drifted across the deck of the USS Port Royal. The sea around the Iranian formation was no longer blue. It was a churned-up mess of white foam, floating debris, and the dark, spreading stain of spilled fuel. The silence that followed the final explosion was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of the American cruiser's engines. As it slowed to a patrol speed, by 7:45 in the morning, the surface duel was over. The tactical screens showed 0 active Iranian surface contacts within 60 miles of the strike group. Every major combatant and nearly every auxiliary vessel of the Iranian surface fleet had been systematically hunted and destroyed. The United States Navy had achieved what generations of naval theorists had described as the decisive battle, a total neutralization of the enemy's maritime power in a single morning. The commander of the strike group issued the order to cease fire and transition to a search and recovery posture for any survivors, though the intensity of the explosions made the likelihood of finding many slim. The mission had moved from an active engagement to a battle damage assessment. The carrier USS Gerald R. continued its steady progress through the Gulf, its massive silhouette a testament to the uncontested dominance of the American fleet. The sun was now fully up, shining on a sea that was finally and violently clear of the enemy. 8 in the morning, the central Persian Gulf. The E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye banked slowly over a sea that had turned into a sprawling iron graveyard. Below the aircraft's rotating radar dome, the deep blue water was scarred by long, oily streaks of black and orange, marking the final resting places of the Iranian surface fleet. The air at 3,000 feet still carried the faint, acrid scent of high explosives and burning diesel, a lingering reminder of the violence that had unfolded over the previous 3 hours. The battle was over, and the time for a professional, cold counting of the cost had begun. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Gerald R. the atmosphere was one of clinical efficiency. The tactical action officers were no longer tracking active threats. They were now cataloging destruction. High-resolution satellite imagery from the National Reconnaissance Office was being fused with live infrared feeds from the strike group's drones to create a comprehensive battle damage assessment. On the primary wall-sized display, a list of Iranian naval assets was being systematically marked with red X symbols, representing confirmed kills. The data was clear and undeniable. The Iranian Navy's surface combat capability in the Persian Gulf had been reduced to 0. The inventory of destruction was staggering. 3 Mauj-class frigates, including the Iranian flagship, were confirmed as total losses. Their remains scattered across the seafloor at a depth of 60 meters. 2 Bayandor-class corvettes had been obliterated by 5-inch gunfire and harpoon missiles, leaving nothing but floating debris fields. 12 Cayman-class missile boats had been intercepted and destroyed by the initial long-range strike, their light hulls unable to withstand the overpressure of the American warheads. The swarm of fast attack craft had fared even worse, with 38 vessels confirmed destroyed by a combination of Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon fire. The subsurface assessment was equally decisive. The USS New Jersey had confirmed the destruction of 1 Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine, with acoustic data suggesting a complete hull collapse following 2 Mark 48 torpedo impacts. There were no indications of any other Iranian subsurface activity within the strike group's operational area. The total tonnage of Iranian steel sent to the bottom of the Gulf was estimated at over 12,000 tons. In a single morning engagement, the United States Navy had effectively erased decades of Iranian naval investment and strategic planning. Naval investment and strategic planning. The human cost on the Iranian side was estimated in the hundreds, though exact figures were impossible to determine given the catastrophic nature of the shipboard explosions. Survivors could be seen clinging to floating wreckage or huddling in bright orange life rafts, their figures small and isolated against the vastness of the sea. The United States Navy, following international maritime law, had begun coordinating with regional coast guards to facilitate rescue operations. Though the strike group remained at a high state of readiness, their sensors still scanning for any sign of a follow-on provocation from the Iranian mainland. In contrast, The status of Carrier Strike Group 12 was a testament to the effectiveness of the Aegis combat system and the training of the American sailor. The USS Gerald R. Ford reported 100% mission capability, with no damage to its hull or flight deck. The cruiser, USS Port Royal, and the destroyer, USS Ramage, also reported 0 damage and 0 casualties. The destroyer USS Thomas Hudner reported minor superficial scarring on its forward superstructure from small arms fired during the swarm engagement, but all primary systems remained fully operational. Not a single United States sailor had been killed or seriously injured in the engagement. The air wing had also returned to the carrier with nearly a clean sheet. All 48 FA-18 Super Hornets and both A-18 Golf Growlers were accounted for. One Super Hornet had experienced a minor bird strike during its low-level run, requiring a replacement of its starboard engine intake, but the aircraft was expected to be back on the flight schedule within 12 hours. The strike group's inventory of precision-guided munitions had been depleted by approximately 40%, but the remaining magazine depth was more than sufficient to handle any remaining regional threats. The humidity continued to build as the sun climbed higher, creating a shimmering heat haze that distorted the horizon. The smell of the sea was beginning to return, slowly masking the chemical stink of the battle. On the bridge of the carrier, the Admiral reviewed the final assessment report before transmitting it to the Pentagon and the White House. The language of the report was dry and technical, avoiding any hint of triumphalism. It was a professional document, detailing the execution of a mission that had achieved every strategic objective with near-perfect efficiency. The Persian Gulf was now a different place than it had been at sunrise. The Iranian threat that had loomed over the Strait of Hormuz for years had been neutralized. In a single, overwhelming demonstration of United States military power, the battle damage assessment was not just a list of sunken ships. It was a clear signal to any other regional actor about the cost of challenging a United States carrier strike group. The wreckage on the seafloor was a silent monument to the lethal precision of the 21st century American Navy. 9 in the morning. The central Persian Gulf, 40 miles south of the previous engagement zone. The combat phase of the operation had concluded, but for the logistics and support personnel of Carrier Strike Group 12, the most critical work was just beginning. The United States Navy maintains its global dominance not only through superior firepower, but through the unparalleled ability to sustain that power in a high-intensity environment. As the smoke from the sunken Iranian fleet faded on the horizon, the strike group transitioned into a state of reconstitution, ensuring every ship and aircraft was returned to 100% combat readiness. The fast combat support ship, USNS Arctic, designated TAOE-8, had been holding at a safe distance during the missile exchange and was now moving into position for a series of complex underway replenishments. The massive supply vessel, displacing nearly 50,000 tons, leveled off on a parallel course with the USS Gerald R. Ford, at a distance of exactly 180 feet. At a speed of 15 knots, the two steel giants were linked. By a series of high-tension cables and fuel hoses, a delicate ballet of seamanship performed in the heavy, humid air of the Gulf. Over the next 4 hours, the USNS Arctic transferred over 2 million gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel and DFM marine diesel to the carrier and its escorts. On the flight deck, the purple shirts, the aviation fuel's boatswain's mates, monitored the high-pressure hoses as they pumped thousands of gallons per minute into the carrier's internal tanks. Simultaneously, large cargo pallets containing fresh provisions, spare parts, and dry stores were transferred via the heavy-lift, stay-out cables. The rhythm of the transfer was a testament to the state-part, professional discipline of the Military Sealift Command and the strike group sailors, executed with a speed and safety that few other navies can replicate. Aviation maintenance was the primary focus on the carrier's 4.5-acre flight deck and in the cavernous hangar bays below. The FA-18 Super Hornet that had suffered the bird strike during the engagement was already surrounded by a team of highly skilled technicians from Strike Fighter Squadron 87. Using a specialized overhead crane, The crew removed the damaged starboard engine, a General Electric 414 turbofan, and replaced it with a fresh unit from the ship's onboard spares. Within 3 hours, the engine was bolted in, tested, and cleared for flight, returning the aircraft to the active flight schedule. The rearming of the strike group's vertical launch systems presented a more significant logistical challenge. While the Mark 41 system is designed for rapid firing, the reloading of the large missile canisters is typically performed in a protected port environment. However, the USS Thomas Hudner and the USS Ramage utilized their onboard cranes to conduct a limited selective reload of essential defensive interceptors, ensuring the fleet's anti-air umbrella remained at maximum density. The ordnance teams worked in the sweltering heat of the deck, their faces slick with sweat as they guided the 2-ton missile canisters into their cells with millimeter precision. Personnel readiness was also a high priority. Despite the lack of combat casualties, the medical department on the USS Gerald R. Ford conducted a fleet-wide wellness check. The focus was on identifying signs of heat exhaustion among the deck crews and providing psychological debriefings for sailors who had been at their battle stations for over 12 consecutive hours. The carrier's primary medical facility, a state-of-the-art trauma center with over 50 beds, remained on standby. But the primary activity was the distribution of hydration and high-calorie meals to the exhausted but victorious crews. At coordinates 25 degrees 30 minutes north, 54 degrees 15 minutes east, the cruiser USS Port Royal conducted a high-speed transit to a nearby rendezvous point with a specialized ammunition ship. The cruiser had expended nearly 40% of its 5-inch ammunition and several of its Harpoon missiles during the final surface duel. The replenishment was executed with the same mechanical precision as the carrier's refueling. The crew moving hundreds of 70-pound projectiles from the supply ship to the cruiser's magazines using automated conveyor systems. The logistical tale of the United States Navy is what transforms a single victory into sustained regional control. By 10:30 in the morning,
this ensures our continued regional control
on enough fuel and supplies to remain on station for another 30 days without further support. The technical reconstitution was nearly complete, with 98% of all aircraft and 100% of all surface combat systems reported as fully operational. The iron flow of supplies had turned the carrier strike group back into a fully loaded weapon, ready for whatever mission might come next. The environmental conditions remained challenging, with the temperature on the flight deck rising to 38 degrees Celsius. The humidity was thick enough to fog the lenses of the maintenance crew's goggles, but the work never slowed. The commander of the strike group reviewed the logistics report with satisfaction. The ability to fight a major naval engagement and then immediately reconstitute in the middle of a contested waterway was a clear message to any adversary. The United States Navy was not just a force of impact, it was a force of endurance. 11 in the morning. The headquarters of United States Central Command. The strategic landscape of the Persian Gulf had been fundamentally transformed in the span of 6 hours. As the digital data from the battle damage assessment reached the highest levels of the Pentagon and the White House, the diplomatic and military branches of the United States government moved to solidify the gains made by Carrier Strike Group 12. The total destruction of the Iranian surface fleet was not just a tactical victory. It was a geopolitical earthquake that shattered the long-standing Iranian strategy of maritime denial and asymmetric warfare in the Strait of Hormuz. The first major repercussion was the formal declaration of a maritime exclusion zone by the United States Department of State. This zone encompassed a rectangular area of over 15,000 square miles, bounded by coordinates 26 degrees 30 minutes north, 54 degrees east, and extending to the western entrance of the strait. Within this zone, all vessels associated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy were declared hostile on sight. The United States Navy served notice to all international commercial shipping that the northern corridors of the Gulf were now under the exclusive protection and control of the American fleet, ensuring the uninterrupted flow of global energy supplies. Regional allies. including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, responded to the engagement with a mixture of public caution and private relief. For decades, these nations had lived under the shadow of Iranian naval provocations and the constant threat of a closed strait. By midday, the air forces of the Gulf Cooperation Council had increased their combat air patrols, coordinating directly with the E-2 Delta Hawkeyes of the Carrier Strike Group to provide a seamless radar picture from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Oman. The integration of regional defenses reached an unprecedented level of efficiency, anchored by the overwhelming presence of the USS Gerald R. Ford. Inside Iran, the internal repercussions were marked by a state of total military and political paralysis. The loss of nearly every modern surface combatant in a single engagement had stripped the Iranian leadership of their primary tool for regional power projection. Intelligence intercepts suggested a chaotic scramble within the Iranian Ministry of Defense as officials attempted to understand how their integrated defense networks had failed so catastrophically against American electronic warfare. The swarm tactic, which had been the centerpiece of their naval doctrine for 20 years, had been neutralized with almost mechanical ease, leading to a profound crisis of confidence among the surviving naval cadres at Bandar Abbas. The global oil markets reacted with an initial spike in prices, driven by the uncertainty of the engagement, but stabilized rapidly as the United States Navy demonstrated its total command of the sea lanes. For the first time in years, insurance premiums for commercial tankers began to trend downward as the threat of Iranian state-sponsored piracy was effectively removed from the board. The maritime industry recognized that the gray zone of Iranian interference had been replaced by a clear, blue-water American hegemony. The Strait of Hormuz, once a choke point, was now a corridor of absolute United States dominance. The strategic shift also forced a recalculation among other global powers, specifically Russia and China, who had been increasing their naval cooperation with Iran. The speed and precision of the American strike served as a sobering reminder of the technological gap that still exists between a United States carrier strike group and any regional adversary. Foreign military attaches in Washington scrambled to analyze the data from the engagement, focusing on the lethality of the long-range anti-ship missiles and the total suppression of enemy sensors by the A-18 Gulf Growlers. The battle had set a new standard for high-end naval warfare in the 26th year of the century. By 1 in the afternoon, the air above the Persian Gulf was filled with the sound of United States and Allied aircraft, creating a continuous canopy of protection over the shipping lanes. The USS Gerald R. Ford maintained its position in the center of the Gulf, its massive silhouette visible on the horizon as a permanent reminder of the cost of provocation. The regional repercussions were clear. The era of Iranian naval expansion was over, and the United States Navy had re-established itself as the sole arbiter of maritime security in the world's most critical waterway. The humidity began to break slightly as a northern breeze moved into the Gulf, clearing some of the lingering smoke from the morning's battle. The water, once a site of intense violence, was now a scene of orderly commerce, as the first line of supertankers began their transit through the newly secured strait. The strategic map of the Middle East had been redrawn, written in the ink of thermal sensors and the iron of sunken hulls. The mission of Carrier Strike Group 12 had moved beyond the kinetic into the realm of lasting regional stability. 4 in the afternoon, on the 18th of March, 2026, the central Persian Gulf. The USS Gerald R. Ford maintained a steady course of 180 degrees at a speed of 20 knots, its massive nuclear-powered hull cutting a clean, white wake through the deep blue water. The heavy, oppressive humidity of the morning had finally begun to lift, replaced by a cooling breeze that carried the clean scent of the open sea. On the 4.5-acre flight deck, the frantic energy of the morning's combat operations had transitioned into the disciplined, rhythmic cycle of routine patrol. The strike group was no longer a force in active engagement. It was once again a silent, watchful guardian of the world's most critical maritime corridor. The report from the carrier's executive officer confirmed that the final recovery of all airborne assets was complete. The last two FA-18 Super Hornets of the Combat Air Patrol had touched down on the deck just minutes prior, their tailhooks catching the number 3 arresting wire with the violent precision that is the hallmark of naval aviation. As the engines were shut down and the pilots climbed out of their cockpits, they were met not with cheers, but with the professional nods of a ground crew that had already prepared the aircraft for their next scheduled mission. The United States Navy does not dwell on the past. It prepares for the immediate future. The strategic summary of Operation Azure Trident was now finalized and transmitted to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In a span of less than 6 hours, Carrier Strike Group 12 had engaged and destroyed the entirety of the Iranian surface fleet without suffering a single hull breach, the loss of a single American life. The tactical success was absolute, but the report remained grounded in the cold reality of professional military analysis. It detailed the expenditure of 48 long-range anti-ship missiles, 16 Hellfire missiles, and approximately 1,200 rounds of 30mm and 5-inch ammunition. The cost of the engagement, measured in millions of dollars of precision-guided ordnance, was deemed a necessary investment in the restoration of regional stability. On the bridge of the cruiser USS Port Royal, the commanding officer looked out over the horizon toward the Iranian coast, which was now a distant, hazy line of brown and tan. The wreckage of the Iranian Navy was now on the seafloor, 60 meters below the surface, where it would remain as a silent testament to the folly of challenging a United States carrier strike group. The exclusion zone was being patrolled by the destroyer screen, ensuring that no further provocations would go unanswered. The sea was clear, the lanes were open, and the first convoy of 20 international oil tankers was already passing through the Strait of Hormuz under the silent protection of the Aegis combat system. The crew of the USS Gerald R. began the process of standing down from their battle stations, a transition marked by the removal of BIS forward, flash protective gear, and the resumption of standard watch rotations. In the mess decks, thousands of sailors shared a quiet meal. The conversation focused not on the destruction they had dealt, but on the technical performance of their systems and the pride they felt in their collective discipline. They were the professionals of the 26th year of the century, a generation of sailors who had proven that the carrier remains the most formidable instrument of national policy ever devised. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and bruised purple. The light reflected off the steel-gray hulls of the strike group, highlighting the jagged, modern lines of the Ford-class carrier and its high-tech escorts. To an outside observer, the fleet looked peaceful, almost serene, but the reality was a state of constant, high-tech vigilance. The AN/SPY-6 radars continued to scan the sky, the sonar arrays continued to listen to the deep, and the pilots in the ready rooms continued to study their mission charts. The mission was accomplished, but the watch never truly ends. The final entry in the carrier's daily log was brief and professional. It recorded the successful neutralization of all hostile surface and subsurface threats in the Persian Gulf, and the re-establishment of maritime security in the region. There were no flourishes of prose or declarations of triumph, only the facts of an operation executed to the highest standards of the United States military. The USS Gerald R. and its strike group had done exactly what they were built to do: project power, protect the peace, and dominate the maritime domain with overwhelming and decisive force. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Gulf, the strike group moved as one toward the open water of the Arabian Sea. The lights on the flight deck were dimmed to a tactical blue, making the carrier nearly invisible against the blackness of the ocean. The sounds of the morning's battle, the roar of missiles, the thud of cannons, and the scream of jet engines had long since faded into the silence of the night. The Persian Gulf was quiet, the threat was gone, and the United States Navy remained on station, ready for the next dawn.